term compromise in politics implies a surrender of certain demands, the renunciation of part one's demands by agreement with another party. This quote is from Lenin's work On Compromises, published in the Rabochi Put newspaper in September of 1917, Moscow, Russia. The vast Russia we know today started with Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, expanding the Moscow territories. After creating a centrally controlled Russian state, he went on to conquer Siberia, the Kazan and Astrakhan region, and the Caspian Sea. 29 years later, his grandson, Mikhail I, began the reign of the Romanov dynasty. Creating the Russian Empire, the Romanovs ruled for 300 years and controlled one-sixth of the entire world's landmass. The empire stretched from the Baltic Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, from the Arctic snows in the north to the sands of Central Asia in the south. The country had the largest European population, with 166 million in 1914. Although the Romanov dynasty succeeded in amplifying their area of control, they failed to compromise between their power and the needs of the people, which led to the greatest conflict of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution of 1917 came after an industrial revolution from 1890 to 1900. In that decade, Russia had done more to industrialize themselves than they had done in a century. But simultaneous to the increase of factories and enterprise, there had to be an increase in laborers. Eager to join the workforce, many farmers as well as immigrants flooded into Russian cities. Russia, not used to dealing with such a growth in population, was not able to provide adequate housing and meals to the newly formed working class. Almost all laborers lived in poverty, struggling to provide for their families or even themselves. Their living conditions usually consisted of large dormitories or tenements with little to no heat. The conditions in the factory were even worse, with extremely crowded workspaces that were often very dangerous for their workers. Many people died from either sickness or unsafe machinery, but below the working class, peasants worked for their landowners for free. They wore rags and shoes made from woven tree bark, while their masters shined in embroidered silks and diamonds. Although the peasants and workers suffered, Russia's upper class of aristocrats and noblemen had luxury beyond imagination. The gap between rich and poor had never been larger in Russia than at that time, but the Romanovs were oblivious to that. This inequality in the Tsar's despotism caused civil unrest among the masses. January 9th, 1905. Outraged but unarmed demonstrators marched on the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. Soldiers fired on the protesters and over 1,000 people were killed or injured. This day became known as Bloody Sunday and sparked the Revolution of 1905. In response to conflict, Nicholas II allowed the creation of the Duma. The Duma was an elected national parliament with limited power over Russia, and its actions could be overwritten by the Tsar at any time. This compromise pleased neither the Tsar nor the revolutionaries. Nicholas II was not willing to give up power for democratic reforms society was calling for. In addition to the internal problems, the country also suffered humiliating defeats during the Russo-Japanese War. Upon the end of that war, Russia was dragged into an even larger conflict that grew into World War I. The country was devastated. They took defeats at most fronts and lost much of their European and Caucasian territory. The Tsar, unhappy with the army's progress, decided to take authority by appointing himself as commander-in-chief. Leaving home to take the front lines, Nicholas II unwillingly put the royal family under the control of Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was said to have saved the Tsar's son, Alexei, from hemophilia, a condition that caused Alexei to experience uncontrolled bleeding. Tsarina Alexandra trusted her notion that Rasputin had miraculous God-given powers, and believed that God spoke through him. Grigory Rasputin was assassinated on December 30th, 1916, by Russian noblemen who thought he had gained too much political power. People lost confidence in the Tsar because of the poor decisions he made during the time of Rasputin's influence. In January of the following year, over 140,000 workers went on strike in remembrance of Bloody Sunday. By February, this number rose to over 200,000. On February 23, 1917, women took to the streets to march for International Women's Day and protested over bread shortages. The next day, their demonstration was joined by students and workers sporting the slogan, "Down with the Tsar." Soldiers sent to disperse the crowds left their positions or refused orders to fire on them, and others followed suit. The protesters took down and destroyed symbols of Tsarism throughout Petrograd. This meant that the government had officially lost control of the capital. The Tsar's council advised him to abdicate, and on March 2, 1917, Tsar Nicholas passed the throne to his brother, who refused it the next day. The former Tsar and his family were kept under house arrest in a palace outside Petrograd. This marked the end of the February Revolution, where a conflict of protests and mutinies resulted in compromise of the Tsar's abdication. After the February Revolution, previous members of the Duma formed the provisional government that took control of Russia. A new Russian constitution was written that abolished monarchy. The provisional government was forced to share its power with the Petrograd Soviet, an elected assembly of workers and soldiers. Both councils supported staying in World War I and honored their commitments with the Western Allies. This decision eventually played into the hands of the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ulyanov Lenin. Germany funded Lenin to return to Russia after years of exile with the intent to stir up turmoil to weaken the country and remove it from the war. Lenin used his great oratorical powers to spread his voice in the working and peasant classes, calling for abolishment of private land, the distribution of food to the Russian people, and an end to World War I. Lenin led his supporters to take over the Petrograd Soviet, formed the Red Guard, an armed force that took over key points in Petrograd, and established the Bolsheviks, a political party that saw themselves as a new form of Russia. The Bolsheviks had a very popular slogan, bread, peace, land, and used it to grow appeal throughout the next month. After a failed military offensive to which 400,000 Russian soldiers died, there was lowered morale in the army, and many Bolsheviks, Bolshevik supporters, and soldiers that had mutinied took to the streets to spread their resentment of the provisional government and the war effort. Soldiers that were loyal to the provisional government fired on the protesters and arrested multiple prominent Bolshevik leaders, including Leon Trotsky, Lenin's top organizer. Lenin, scared that he would be captured, fled to Finland. While Lenin was away, Alexander Kerensky, a socialist and Menshevik, was appointed as prime minister and was hailed as the savior of Russia. Kerensky also supported staying in the war and was backed up by a man known as General Kornilov. Kornilov was extremely pro-war and thought that the revolution was looking to undermine the war effort. General Kornilov despised Lenin and accused him of being a German spy that was trying to sabotage him. Kornilov led the men still under his control on a march to take over the capital, but strikes by Bolshevik-influenced relay workers meant that Kornilov's progress was slowed to a halt. By then, there was nothing Kornilov could have done to stop the revolution. The task of a truly revolutionary party is not to declare that it is impossible to renounce all compromises, but to be able, through all compromises, when they are unavoidable, to remain true to its principles, to its class, to its revolutionary purpose, to its task of paving the way for revolution and educating the mass of people for victory in the revolution. Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was a true master of compromise and artfully used it to accomplish his main goals. In September of 1917, Bolsheviks had taken a large majority of seats in the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin then knew it was time to act. He returned from Finland on October 10th and started planning the Bolshevik October Revolution. At 9:40 p.m. on October 25th, 1917, a blank shot from the cruiser Aurora signaled to the Bolsheviks to start the invasion of the Winter Palace, the beginning of the October Revolution. On that night, the Bolsheviks were able to seize multiple key points in Petrograd. The next morning, Lenin announced the overthrow of the provisional government, and Russia was under Bolshevik control from that point on. The Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on March 3, 1918, which removed Russia from World War I. But the Bolsheviks ignited their own civil war with the White Army, an armed force that believed they could re-establish Tsarism in Russia. Meanwhile, Nicholas II and his family were moved to the Siberian city of Tobolsk, and then to Yekaterinburg. As the White Army campaigned towards Yekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks gathered the entire royal family in a cellar and executed them all. Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, their daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and their son, Tsarevich Alexei. The Romanov dynasty and the Russian Empire ended because of their inability to compromise and their ignorance to the reasons for conflict between them and the lower classes. The Bolsheviks, however, compromised their way through the rule of the provisional government and Petrograd Soviet. In fact, many Bolsheviks gave up seats in their local councils or even the Petrograd Soviet in order to represent their ideologies in the streets. The Russian Revolution of 1917 saw the collapse of an empire under Tsar Nicholas II and the rise of Marxian socialism under Lenin and the Bolsheviks. It sparked the beginning of the USSR era that had effects on countries around the world.